I had been sitting in that conference room for 11 minutes before my wife's attorney looked at me the way you look at something you've tracked in on your shoe. I was wearing my old Carhartt work shirt, the brown one with the frayed collar and a small paint smear near the third button that I'd never quite gotten out. I'd bought it at a hardware store in 2009 for $31, and I'd worn it to every job site I'd worked since. It was clean. It was pressed. But it was not the kind of shirt a man wears when he wants to be taken seriously in a room full of people who bill $400 an hour. My wife's attorney, a man named Hargrove who wore cufflinks on a Tuesday, let his eyes travel from my collar to the table and back again before he said anything. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that isn't really a smile, and opened his folder. I folded my hands and waited. I want to tell you something before I get into what happened in that room. I want to tell you who I was before any of this started, because I think it matters. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed civil engineer working on infrastructure projects across the southeast bridges, drainage systems, highway overpasses. I was not a glamorous man. I never pretended to be. I drove the same Ford F-150 for 14 years. I coached Little League on Saturday mornings even when my knees started bothering me. I grilled on Sundays and went to bed at 10 and woke up at 5:30 and was, by every measure I knew, a completely ordinary American man who loved his family and asked for very little in return. My wife and I had been married for 26 years. Her name doesn't matter anymore, so I'll just call her my wife, because that's what she was and what she stopped wanting to be. We had a son, Derek, 31 now, lives in Nashville, and a daughter named Patrice, who was 28 at the time all of this happened and who had just gotten engaged to a good man named Russell. My wife had gone back to work when the kids were in high school. She got into commercial real estate, and she was good at it. By the time Derek left for college, she was making more than I was. I never had a problem with that. I was proud of her. I told her so. What I didn't know, for a long time, was that she had also started spending a great deal of time with her managing broker, a man I'll call her boss, because that's what he was supposed to be. He was 51, drove a Porsche Cayenne, and had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything in his own mind. He had taken my wife to 3 industry conferences in 18 months. I believed her when she told me they were mandatory. I found out the truth the same way most men my age find out these things, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a receipt. A hotel receipt for a room in Savannah that appeared on our joint account in November 2 years ago, on a weekend when my wife had told me she was visiting her sister in Macon. Her sister lives in Macon. The hotel was in Savannah. Those are not the same city. I didn't say anything right away. I know some men would have, but I am an engineer by training, and engineers don't react to a single data point. They gather more. Over the next 6 weeks, I gathered more. I won't go through all of it, because the specifics don't change what it was. What it was a 2-year affair with a man who had been in my home for Thanksgiving dinner, who had shaken my hand and thanked me for the pecan pie, who had looked me in the eye while all of that was already happening. I'm 63 years old, and I have not cried easily since I was a young man, but I cried in my truck in the parking lot of a Publix on a Wednesday afternoon in December, and I am not ashamed of it. My wife filed for divorce in January. She had already spoken to Hargrove. She moved into her boss's house in Buckhead 2 weeks later. At the time, I had recently retired from my engineering firm and had been running a small, private consulting practice out of my home office, reviewing structural plans, signing off on county inspections, that kind of work. It was not glamorous work. It paid about $68,000 a year. Hargrove made sure the mediator knew this number. He said it slowly and let it sit in the air like he'd just revealed something important. My wife was making $240,000 a year, plus commission. Her boss's brokerage had done $11 million in residential transactions the previous quarter alone. Hargrove wanted the house. He wanted my wife to keep her retirement accounts intact. He wanted a settlement structure that would leave me with my truck, my tools, my pension, and approximately 14 months of living expenses if I was careful. He presented all of this with the tone of a man who had already decided how the story ended. What Hargrove did not know, what my wife did not know, was that 8 months earlier, I had walked into a federal building in downtown Atlanta and sat across from two agents from the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, and I had handed them a flash drive. Let me back up. I had known something was off about my wife's boss for a long time before I knew anything was off about my wife. It is an odd thing to say, but it's true. Years ago, my wife had mentioned, almost in passing, that her boss had a second set of property records, that some of the brokerage's transactions were being run through a shell company registered in Wyoming. She hadn't thought much of it. She was telling me as a curiosity, something that seemed a little unusual but that she assumed had some legitimate explanation. I am an engineer. I also have a minor in accounting from Georgia Tech, which I rarely mention because it rarely comes up. But when my wife told me about the Wyoming Shell Company, I filed it away. When I found the hotel receipt in November, and I began to understand what had been happening in my marriage, I started paying closer attention to everything. And when I eventually sat down one sleepless night and started pulling public transaction records, which are available to anyone willing to spend a few hours on county property websites, I found things that did not add up. Properties sold at significant undervalue to holding companies that then resold them 6 months later at full market price, commission structures that didn't match the recorded sale prices. A pattern, repeated across 4 counties over 6 years, that suggested someone was moving money through real estate transactions in a way designed to avoid federal reporting requirements. I'm not a forensic accountant. I want to be clear about that. But I know how numbers are supposed to behave, and these numbers were not behaving. I hired an attorney not for the divorce, not yet, but a different kind of attorney. A former federal prosecutor who now ran a small practice in Decatur. I showed him what I had found. He was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. 2 months later, I was meeting with the IRS Criminal Investigation Team. I want to be honest about my motivations, because I have thought about them a great deal in the time since. Was I angry? Yes. Was I hurt? Profoundly. Did some part of me want to watch my wife's boss face consequences for what he had done to my marriage? I would be lying if I said no. But I also want to say this. When I sat in that federal building and looked at the documents spread across that table, the scale of what this man had done went far beyond my personal situation. Over 6 years, investigators believed he had laundered somewhere between $30 and $45 million through falsified real estate transactions. There were other people involved, investors who had been defrauded, properties manipulated, tax obligations evaded at a scale that required serious coordination and serious deception. This was not a man who had made some poor choices. This was a man who had been systematically criminal for the better part of a decade. So yes, I cooperated, fully, and I kept cooperating quietly for 8 months. While Hargrove prepared his settlement documents, and my wife moved her things into her boss's house in Buckhead, and my daughter Patrice called me on Sunday evenings to ask how I was doing in the careful voice of someone who is worried, but doesn't want to show it. I told Patrice I was fine. I told her her old dad still knew how to take care of himself. She didn't entirely believe me, I think, but she let it go. The mediation was set for a Thursday morning in March at Hargrove's firm on Peachtree Street. I wore my Carhartt shirt. I drove my truck. I parked in a $2 lot 2 blocks away and walked. My attorney met me in the lobby. His name was Gerald, and he was 67 years old and had been practicing family law in Atlanta for 35 years, and he had the particular calm of a man who has seen almost everything and learned not to be rattled by the rest. Gerald looked at my shirt and said nothing about it. He said, "Good morning, Ray," and handed me a cup of coffee, and we took the elevator to the 14th floor. My wife was already in the conference room. She looked good, she had always looked good, and she looked at me the way you look at someone you used to know well and are now trying to recategorize in your mind. There was some pity in it, I thought, some discomfort, and underneath that, barely visible, something that might have been guilt, though I could not be certain. Hargrove introduced his paralegal and a woman from his firm who handled financial documentation. He did not ask how I was doing. He put his folder on the table and said he hoped we could get through this efficiently. Gerald said that sounded fine. The first 45 minutes were routine. Hargrove walked through the asset list. The house, which we had bought together in 2004 and which was now worth somewhere around $680,000. The retirement accounts. My consulting income. He was methodical and pleasant in the way that expensive attorneys are pleasant. A professional warmth that evaporates the moment it becomes inconvenient. At some point, he said, with his eyes on his documents rather than on me, "Of course, given the disparity in current earning capacity, we think it's reasonable that my client retain the primary residence. Mr. Calloway's consulting work is," he paused, as if searching for a word modest. My wife glanced at my shirt, just briefly, but I saw it. I drank my coffee. Gerald had a folder in front of him that he had not yet opened. He had told me, before we went in, that he would wait for the right moment. I had asked him how he would know the right moment. He had said, 35 years of practice, Ray. You get a feel for it. Hargrove was beginning to outline the proposed distribution of the retirement accounts when Gerald put his hand on the folder. Before we continue, Gerald said, in the same even voice he had used all morning, I'd like to introduce some documentation that's relevant to the disposition of marital assets. Hargrove looked up. What kind of documentation? Financial documentation, Gerald said. He opened the folder. Specifically, documentation related to certain transactions conducted by Whitmore Realty Group through its affiliated holding companies between 2017 and 2023, and the exposure this may create for individuals with documented financial entanglement with those entities. The room was very quiet. My wife's expression did not change for a moment. Then it did. Hargrove said, I'm not sure what that has to do with... Your client, Gerald said, has co-signed 3 promissory notes with a principal who is currently under active federal investigation for money laundering and tax fraud. Her assets, including income, commissions, and the property she is requesting in this settlement, may be subject to civil forfeiture proceedings depending on the outcome of that investigation. I would like to make sure everyone in this room understands that before we finalize any agreement about what those assets are worth or to whom they belong. He slid 3 pages across the table. Hargrove picked them up. He read. He set them down. He picked them up again. My wife said, What is this? Gerald said, You may want to speak with your attorney privately before answering that question. There was a recess. It lasted 47 minutes. When they came back in, Hargrove was several degrees quieter than he had been before. The paralegal had left the room and not returned. My wife sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at a point somewhere between her and the window. Hargrove said his client would need time to consult with additional counsel before proceeding. Gerald said that was completely understandable. I drove home in my truck. Gerald had told me, in the elevator on the way down, that he expected the dynamics to shift considerably in the next few weeks. He was right. What neither of us knew yet was how considerably, or how quickly. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, federal agents executed search warrants at 4 properties associated with my wife's boss and the Whitmore Realty Group. His Buckhead house was among them. I found this out not through any dramatic phone call, but through a brief item in the Atlanta Business Chronicle. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and then I sat there for a little while and thought about a lot of things. My wife called me that afternoon. It was the first time she had called me directly since the divorce filing. She sounded like a person trying very hard to sound calm, which is different from actually being calm. She asked if I had known this was coming. I told her I had known some things for a while. I told her I was sorry she was going through something difficult, and I meant it not because what she had done to our marriage was forgivable, but because I am 63 years old and I have known enough hard things to understand that watching the life you chose come apart is its own particular punishment, and I did not need to add to it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Did you do this to hurt me? I thought about that question for a while before I answered. No, I said. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I am still the same man I was when you married me, whether or not that ended up mattering to you. She didn't say anything after that. We stayed on the line for a few more seconds, and then the call ended. The divorce was settled 4 months later. The terms were different from what Hargrove had originally proposed. Considerably different. I won't go through every detail, but I will say that the house remained in my possession, and the settlement was structured in a way that allowed me to live without financial anxiety for the first time in several years. My wife retained her own retirement accounts and a fair share of other assets, and I am not a vindictive person by nature. I did not want to leave her with nothing. I wanted what was fair. I did receive a payment from the IRS's whistleblower program the following spring. The investigation into the Whitmore Realty Group ultimately resulted in charges against my wife's boss and 2 of his associates, with a recovery figure north of $38 million. The whistleblower percentage was modest relative to that number, but it was not a small amount of money by any reasonable measure. I've told exactly 3 people about that payment: Gerald, my son Derek, and my daughter Patrice. Patrice cried a little and then laughed and said I was the most quietly dangerous man she had ever known, which I think was meant as a compliment. I used part of the money to pay off the house completely. I put a portion into a trust for Patrice and Russell to use when they're ready to buy a home. The rest I invested carefully, in the low-drama way that a 63-year-old man with modest tastes tends to invest money. I still wear my old Carhartt shirt. It fits the same as it always did. The paint smear near the 3rd button is still there. I think about what that shirt represents to me sometimes, not wealth or poverty or status or any of the things Hargrove thought he was reading when he looked at it on that Thursday morning in March. I think it represents the fact that I have always known who I am. I knew who I was at 32 when I was climbing around on bridge scaffolding in the Georgia heat, and I knew who I was at 63 when I sat in that conference room and let a man in custom cufflinks make assumptions about me that were going to cost him the rest of the day. There is a certain freedom in being underestimated. I wish I had understood that earlier in my life, though I'm not sure what I would have done with the knowledge. Maybe nothing. Maybe I just would have ironed the shirt. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I told Derek when he asked me if I had any regrets, is that the hardest part of the whole experience was not the betrayal, though the betrayal was hard. It was not the legal proceedings or the months of uncertainty or the nights I sat alone in the house I'd lived in for 20 years and tried to recalibrate what the rest of my life was going to look like. The hardest part was remembering, every single day, that integrity is not contingent on whether anyone notices it. I had to keep doing the right thing, even when the wrong things were being done to me. I had to keep being the person I had always been, even when the life I'd built around that person was being dismantled piece by piece. That took more out of me than I usually admit. But I did it. And I would do it again. My son called me last week. He's doing well, working in finance, just bought a house, talking seriously about proposing to the woman he's been with for 3 years. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was good. I told him I'd spent the morning reviewing a structural assessment for a county project in Gwinnett, that I'd had a good lunch, that the weather had been fine. He said, "Dad, you're honestly the most boring, exciting person I know." I told him thank you very much. I am 63 years old. I own my house outright. I drink my coffee at 6 in the morning and watch the light come up over the backyard where I used to push 2 kids on a swing set, and I do not feel sorry for myself, and I do not feel bitter, and I do not feel any particular need to explain myself to anyone who has already decided what kind of man I am based on what I'm wearing. I already know what kind of man I am. I always have.